Hey, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. I am sitting in my new home office. This is the first week I'm really operating out of there because we are selling the building that I have operated out of for the last year. It's under contract, though in the middle of inspection, so that's great but terrifying. And I'm in the process of setting up my office at home, and so I'm very excited about that. How are you doing?
I'm trying to be okay. That's my answer. So yesterday we were supposed to meet up with a wrecker who was going to come to the car shop and buy our broken down vehicle that we didn't find to be worth replacing or fixing. And there was one snafu after another, and in total, Shelley and I spent 6 hours tooling around town, just killing time, waiting for a tow truck to arrive, and it never arrived.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So we just wasted our whole day. I mean, okay, so I say wasted because it was undirected time.
Because
Shelley's
what could be worse than spending time with your wife?
See, that's the other side of it, right? Shelley's like, we got to go just tool around. It was fun. It was like a little date. And I'm like, if I want to have a date, I want to have a date on purpose and go where I want to go, not just I don't know, we can go within a 3-mile radius. What do you want to do?
No, absolutely. Let's be real. It is not a date if it wasn't on the calendar.
Yeah, I knew I was talking to the right person about this.
100% with you.
So anyway, so we still have to figure out how to get the wrecker to come pick up our truck. And I'm trying to be okay. So let's not talk about that anymore.
Okay. Sorry, I'm now swallowing all my sarcastic comments.
That is impressive. You're going to get indigestion from that.
And I may not have the energy to say anything else all episode. So this one's you, buddy.
Okay. All right. If this episode flops, I'll own that.
Hey, let me get your mind off of that, if that's all right.
Oh, that's more than all right.
Okay. I had 2 very similar conversations yesterday with 2 very different people, and it just got me thinking about a topic that I'm really intrigued by. One of the conversations was with a coaching client that I have who is middle-aged. He is a professional, and he is very advanced in life. The other is with my junior in high school son. And both of them were saying that their overall stress in life was too high. And both of them were expressing a desire to lower their stress. But what I thought was fascinating is that both of them made the same leap to what it meant to lower their stress. And this is what I was intrigued by and wanted to share with you because I thought it was an interesting and really valuable leap. And I wanted to process it out. And in both those conversations, I'm in the conversation for the other person. So I wanted to have my own conversation about this thing that they both said.
Right.
So what they both said in different words, and I'm going to use my words to describe it, was that what they wanted to do was not react with less stress to specific situations. If on a scale of 1 to 10, a certain event is going to cause you 3 points worth of stress, then it just is going to cause you 3 points of stress. It is what it is. They were both saying that they start the day with a certain amount of, you could call it ambient stress, or really the analogy that I like the best. You know how you have a resting heart rate?
Mm-hmm.
And your resting heart rate is what your heart is beating at when you're doing absolutely nothing else. So there's virtually no waking moment in your day when your heart is actually at your resting heart rate. It just starts there, and whatever activity or whatever is going on in your life, your heart rate goes up from there. Listening to both of these two guys talk, the image in my mind that began to kind of coalesce is that we have a resting stress rate, sort of the amount of stress we're carrying before we deal with the day's stressors. And both of them were saying, if I'm really going to respond the way I want to respond to the stressors in my life, what I need to do is lower my resting stress rate. And so I want to ask two questions. First of all, I want your reaction to that sort of metaphor or way of thinking, and I'm curious to see if that resonates. And second, I'm curious to kind of kick around this idea of lowering our resting stress rate.
Yeah, the metaphor itself is helpful. And I think just the overall concept of a resting stress rate is helpful. But here's the problem that I have. This is my problem. I don't notice my resting stress rate. I don't notice my stress rate until my stress meter has peaked, right? Like until I'm in the red. So if the red starts at 90% or something like that, and my resting stress rate is at 40%, I couldn't tell you that I was at 40%. I would probably tell you I'm at 0. I can't notice the fact that there is actually stress going on. But what I do notice is that I go very, very quickly to 90 or above. And that tells me I wasn't at 0. I was somewhere closer to 90 than I thought. And I don't know how to even quantify my own resting stress rate or know that I have one. Does that make sense?
It 100% does. And this is, I think, the first challenge in dealing with, if this idea is true that we have a resting stress rate, I think you are hitting on a really important first question, which is, how do we pay attention to our resting stress rate before? Because I think what you're saying is, I notice my stress rate when it damages my life. I notice my stress rate when I react negatively to my kids. I notice my stress rate when I react negatively to my wife. I notice my stress rate when I want to kill a driver. Right?
Right. Well, and even yesterday, right? After the 6th and final hour of waiting around in town, and I finally get the official word, it isn't going to happen today. We're going to have to reschedule. I slammed my car door and I drove like a madman home, and I stomped around the house and I got dressed, and I'm like, well, I'm finally just going to go out there and work on the chicken coop because I'm going to do something with my day and feel like I did something. And it ruined the rest of my night. And it was like, dude, really? All because a tow truck didn't come up and pick up your car? Something was going on in my life before that moment. That's not enough stress to spike the meter. But for me, it was.
Yeah. So this is layers, right? I think you're hitting, let's say, the moment 20 minutes after I go for a run. There is my resting heart rate. But then there's what my heart is doing because I was running. And 20 minutes later, it's not like I drop back to my resting heart rate all of a sudden. I have an elevated heart rate because I was exercising. And I think you have, I think you're dealing with not only whatever your resting stress rate was, but then poured on top of that was this other stressor. And this is one of the things I think is intriguing about this idea of looking at stress this way. It explains why we turn molehills into mountains. Because suddenly, if I'm starting at a 6 and something is a 2, if I were starting at a 4, I would go to 6. It's not a big deal. But if I'm starting at 6 and I add 2, all of a sudden I'm at 8.
Yeah.
But for me, I wouldn't notice if I were in your situation that you described about yesterday. I wouldn't notice I was stressed until I cut my finger on the chicken coop chicken wire.
So you're saying you would notice it even later in the game?
Yes, I think I would. I think slowly I'm bringing that backwards. But I think my natural inclination is to not notice it until it does damage. You know, like I said, I'll yell at somebody and think, why did I just yell at them? Or I have to have somebody tell me, you are talking in a really short way. And I have to and I'll be like, no, I'm not. Oh, yes, I am. And
yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a really fascinating part of the conversation, but I always feel like this is the unanswerable part, which is, how do you notice more? I don't know. You notice.
Well, this is where I think we say it's unanswerable, but I'm not convinced that's true. So if God is commanding me to have self-control, and I'm identifying that I can only have self-control if I'm aware of my own thoughts, I don't know that I get to give myself the out of saying, this is impossible. I can give myself the out of saying, I am so bad at this. It reminds me, I guess what I'm saying is, it reminds me of the conversation we often have when you start reading a new topic. You know how you need those hooks to hang your hat on?
Yeah.
We use this analogy all the time.
Right.
I feel like we are just such novices, and I don't even mean just you and me. I think at minimum, we as Americans are such novices at knowing our own thought life that we tend to look at the idea of self-awareness and go, well, that's impossible, so why think about it?
No, you're exactly right. And I think one of the hooks that I'm learning to put into place is this idea of a body scan. This is something that Andy Kolber talks about in Try Softer, and a lot of other therapists incorporate as well. And it's really just pausing to notice, just straight from the top of your head down to your toes, what is your body doing? What is your body telling you? And it was fascinating. The other day, I was sitting in a time of prayer, which should have been nothing but peaceful, right? I guess is the image we have in our mind about prayer. But I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I noticed all of this tension. My shoulders were tense, my stomach was tense, my muscles in my arms and my legs were tense. And I consciously chose to relax everything. And I was like, man, what was that all about? Where's all this tension coming from? And all I was doing was sitting in a recliner in a posture of prayer. So that idea of a body scan and doing that multiple times, I think gives you a barometer, right? It's like taking your temperature every so often. And if you can check your resting heart rate, maybe we'll go with that analogy, right? If you check your heart rate multiple times throughout the day, maybe then you can start noticing patterns, and when is your heart rate elevated and why might that be? And right. And at least you have data.
Yeah, I think this is a huge part of it. I think you're absolutely right. I've also found the idea of a body scan to be incredibly valuable. I do this on a regular basis, and I can't tell you the number of times I've done this. And I don't say that to pat myself on the back. I say that because just yesterday, I realized something about the way that I physically carry stress that I had not quite understood before, despite the fact that I've done this a zillion times. And I was just laughing. I was like, come on, really?
Yeah, right.
And then the other piece of this that's been exceptionally helpful, kind of the sibling to the body scan that is exceptionally helpful to me, is this mindfulness practice of paying attention to my breath for a couple of minutes every day. And the reason this is helpful, and I feel like I've said this several times on the podcast before, so I don't want to overstate it, but the reason this is helpful is because when you pay attention to your breathing, just to the kind of motion of in and out, you start to see what intrudes on your attempt to pay attention to your breathing. So I'm breathing in and I'm thinking about the fact that I have to record this podcast, and I'm breathing out and I'm breathing in, and suddenly I'm thinking about this conversation I had with somebody 2 years ago, and I'm breathing out. And allowing those thoughts to come to center stage, acknowledging that they're there and letting go of them has helped me at least cultivate an awareness. As the body scan helps me know what's going on physically with me, the breathing practice helps me know what's going on mentally with me.
And then there's this question of what to do with that data, right? And how do we actually lower, as both your client and your son were asking, how do we lower our resting stress rate? And one possible answer came to me a couple of weeks ago. I was in a peer support team training for work. And so this is a collection of volunteers at the 911 center. Other places have these, police departments, fire departments, all of these other places that are specially trained by therapists to be able to go and support your colleagues after a traumatic incident, or just generally speaking in the course of life at work. And so as I was in that training, one of the things that the therapist said was really fascinating. And that was, there's been some studies recently about the power of green spaces, like think woods or gardens or things like that, to reset the nervous system. I think in our modern society, we are deprived of green spaces. We spend a lot of time either in our houses or in our places of work or on a computer or plugged into headphones or in a car, right? None of these are green spaces. And we keep building and building and building more stress, more cortisol, more whatever in our bodies. And we have no opportunity to flush it out. And green spaces, at least by some studies, and by my own anecdotal personal experience, give you that opportunity to reset. And that matters.
Man, this totally makes sense to me. When I hear you talk about green space, first of all, this makes sense anecdotally to me. When we first moved to Missouri, I slowly over the course of about 6 to 8 months switched from primarily running on the road to primarily running in the woods on trails. And I would come home and say to Kristen, and I know that this is like true-ish, but it still felt weird to say. I would say, Kristen, it feels like the oxygen is different. And I think that was a piece of it. But as I've kind of done this a little bit, the other thing that's fascinating to me about the woods is everything is going really slow. You know, you've got these trees that have been busy growing for 60, 80, 100 years, and they grow at a couple inches a year. You've got the grass that's just kind of growing. You've got the wind that's blowing through the trees. Typically, if you're there, not all that fast. Even most days when I run in the woods, I'll see a deer or two, and they just sort of stand there. And then they scamper off somewhere and stand there. And there's this slowness to green space that I think is a really powerful counteragent to life that is going at highway speeds.
Right. And I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but I'm reading this book called Why We Sleep. And I think our chronic lack of sleep is another contributing factor to our resting stress rate. And it's been fascinating to read this book and to see literally what goes on in our brains while we sleep and the way that it is filing and processing all of the information throughout the day. And if we don't give ourselves a full 8 hours to process that, then our brain literally has not filed everything away by the time we've woken back up. But not only is it filing information, it is making sense of that information, both on like a cognitive, like putting the pieces together level, but also on an emotional level, and being able to connect how we feel about all of these different events so that we're in a much better place to respond the next day. And it talked all about the different chemicals that build up in your body throughout the day and how those get processed over the course of the night. And it needs these full sleep cycles to fully process all of those chemicals that have built up in our bodies. And so I think we just aren't sleeping enough, and therefore we have too many chemicals building up in our body. We have too much information building up in our brains. And we have too much emotional complexity that is undealt with, all from lack of sleep, which sounds so simple, but I think it's a big, big part of this.
No, I think you're right. This is why, as we are in these first couple of chapters in the book of Psalms, because we're in our Summer on the Psalms series, when I think of spiritual disciplines, the first one that comes to mind is from one of these early Psalms, and I actually forget which one it is and didn't have notes on this because I wasn't planning on talking about it. But it's the place in one of these early Psalms where it says something to the effect of, I can lie down and rest because you're in control.
Yeah, I think that's 3:5.
Okay. Because it's not just what sleep does for me, but who I have to become in order to sleep well. Trusting people sleep better. Right?
That's so good.
And that is the healthy person I was designed to be, was a person who knows that there is a power greater than I, that I can entrust the world to for a third of the day every day. This is a great sign about what God wants us to do in our lives, that he designed us to spend a third of every single day surrendering control.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's fascinating, like this book on sleep, I can't recommend it enough. You talk about surrendering control. When we are in REM sleep, our body is literally paralyzed. Which for good reason, right? Because all of our brain circuitry is firing, including all of our muscle movement circuitry. And so if we didn't get paralyzed while we did all of that, we would literally physically act out all of these different sensations that that we're processing. And that's problematic. So you talk about surrender and give up control. Like we literally have no control when we're in REM sleep.
Yeah. And I find that fascinating. I don't think that's an accident. Not just that one detail of it, but the fact that we are designed to be out of control. Another piece for me that kind of ties into this, when I am stressed, the first action or my first reaction is to try to get rid of the stress. If I were visualizing my reaction, my emotional reaction to stress, it is the act of pushing away. And for my coaching practice, I've been reading a fairly lengthy book on acceptance and commitment therapy, which is an approach to counseling that has an analogous approach to coaching. And the first piece of this is choosing to welcome in all of my actions and reactions to things, or I should say all of my emotional reactions to things. If I think something, I'm not going to try to push it away. I'm going to allow it to take center stage for a moment. If I feel something, I'm not going to avoid it. I'm going to allow it to take center stage for a moment. Always knowing that allowing a thought or a feeling to take center stage doesn't mean it's controlling me, because I am more than my thoughts and feelings. I'm more than my urges.
Mm-hmm.
I have a soul that allows me to say yes or no to thoughts, feelings, and urges and experiences. So I don't ever have to be afraid of them. And one of the arguments that this approach to counseling and coaching makes is that the harder you push away your thoughts, feelings, and urges, the stronger they grow.
Mm.
And I think, to our point about resting stress rate, if I'm spending heaps of my emotional energy pushing away things that come naturally into my heart and mind, that's got to raise my resting stress rate if I'm constantly pushing things down.
You're right. Right? Yeah, I think sometimes we think about things being stuffed as, well, that's just going to, you're going to keep stuffing and stuffing and stuffing, and eventually all of that is going to come back out. I think we generally acknowledge that, but I don't think we often acknowledge the amount of energy and stress it takes to do the stuffing.
Yeah, and it's not a one-time thing, right? This is the analogy of the beach ball in the water, right? Have you heard this?
Yeah, right? Mm-hmm.
I'm having to hold it under the water all the time.
Yeah.
And that's exhausting. And wildly counterproductive is one of the arguments that acceptance and commitment therapy thinking makes. Because what I'm really doing by stuffing is saying to myself, I'm not going to think about X. I'm not going to think about X. I'm not going to think about X. The result of which is that in the very thought, I'm thinking about X. Because X is part of the sentence, I'm not going to think about X.
Yeah.
So I am actively avoiding it. And the result of actively avoiding it is that I'm doing it more, which means I have to put more work in trying to avoid it. But every time I put more work into trying to avoid it, I'm doing it. And it's this spiral of energy sucking.
No, exactly. These are the hidden things that contribute to our resting stress rate. Here's the thing. Sometimes people say, I'll deal with that later. Okay, neat. When exactly is later? Because
exactly.
I'm not sure that you've actually ever gotten to later. And so, to say, okay, I am going to take some time and I'm just going to allow these feelings to come up. I'm going to process them. I'm going to experience them. That is okay. Right? And then instead of holding the balloon or the beach ball under the water, we have just let the air out of the beach ball. And all of a sudden we can put that wherever we need to put it.
Which, let's be honest, that's scary.
Sure.
There's a reason I'm pushing that beach ball under the water. I don't want to deal with it. And so the question, as I get practical with myself and my client and my son, the question I find myself asking, and this is the other part of acceptance and commitment therapy, is what does it mean to be values driven? Who do I want to be that allowing these things into the light uniquely allows me to be?
Yeah. We've talked a lot on this podcast about being overdoing and how that is a spiritual discipline even. I don't know that we've used those words for it, but that's what I think it is. And so if we talk about the importance of being overdoing, then I think we start to see, oh, okay, God is forming me into a particular person with a particular character and a particular way of showing up in the world. And one of the things that gets in the way of that formation or that being the person that God intends me to be is I'm carrying a lot of unnecessary stress. And my resting stress rate is too high. So I need to do these things like face whatever that beach ball is, or I need to get into green spaces, or I need to commit to 8 hours of sleep, or whatever it is. this sounds like, because you've mentioned a therapeutic approach a couple of different times now. And I think it could be easy to just dismiss this as, this is just pop psychology. This is just, this has nothing to do with following Jesus. This is just like, here's your self-help lesson for the day. I think our mental and emotional aspects impact our spirituality greatly. And we do need to deal with it in order to be the people that God is designing us to be.
I think you're exactly right. When I think about what makes it worth spending a few minutes every day paying attention to my breath or doing a body scan or going out in the woods, I have a million other things that need to get done. And I wrestle with this all the time. Like there's always another option. And the thing that makes it worth it is I want to be a listener. And I can be a listener better. Like I can listen to my wife better if I have paid attention to my breath every day for the last week. I can listen to my friends and my children better if I have taken the time to exercise every other day. And it doesn't feel like a big deal to skip one, but I know it'll cost my listening. And listening, I'm not saying listening should matter to everybody, but that's the thing I've realized. I want to be a listener. And I get to participate with God in forming myself by choosing to be out in the woods or choosing to pay attention to my breath for a few minutes. And those things help me be the person I, in participation with God, want to be.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have overemphasized doing in our society. And that doesn't look like doing anything. Like if you really want to do something for Jesus, you should be out sharing the gospel, or you should be out helping the homeless, or you should be out whatever. Reading Greek. That one's actually true. But
buying flowers for your wife because you told her yesterday you didn't want to spend 6 hours with her because that was a waste of time.
I'm editing that out of the episode.
I managed to make it over half an hour without making that crack.
Do you feel better now? Did you let the air out of your beach ball? Okay. Well, maybe I should just talk to the audience now instead.
They're clearly better listeners than me.
Yeah. You've been shunned. You're done. So to our faithful audience who has not yet interrupted with any snarky comments, thank you. I want to say, what is your resting stress rate? How do you know? And what are your tried and true ways of dealing with it? I think we all need to build up our toolkit. So I would love to learn from one another about what matters to you in reducing your resting stress rate. That would be awesome.
Absolutely. I would love to hear that.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn the conversation back to you, Josh from Missouri. It is our Summer in the Psalms series, and I get to hear Psalms thoughts from you.
Yeah, I am super excited. First of all, it's been very fun to be reading the Psalms again. I have enjoyed the kind of daily rhythm of going into them, and it's been really interesting for me to see my very different reaction to reading them in the Message this year from last year, because last year I read, I think, the first Psalm in the Message and was like, nope, Peterson is driving me crazy. I'm going back to ESV.
There are aspects I was going to say something very similar. There are times where Peterson is just like, dude, you are so wordy.
Well, and his attempt to modernize makes me wrestle. There's some moment where God puts on a black trench coat, and I was just, it forces me to wrestle with the imagery in ways that are very helpful. But anyway, that's not my thought from this week. My thought from this week is Psalm 8, verse 5, which, just for context's sake, in the ESV, it says, you have made him, meaning mankind, humanity, a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. The Message translates it, yet we've so narrowly missed being gods, bright with Eden's dawn light. There is, first of all, something just wistful that Peterson catches that is the ESV doesn't. This sort of longing to be more. And then this sort of, here's the way my brain went. It said, what does this bright with Eden's dawn light phrase mean? Because it's so much clearer in the ESV. And then I looked at it in the ESV, and it's, like I said, the second half of the verse is, crowned him, humanity, with glory and honor. And I thought, actually, I have no idea what that means either. And what I'm appreciating in Peterson is that there are times I assume I understand what I'm reading, when in fact, I'm just so used to the metaphor, I think the metaphor is the thing itself.
Yeah.
And I'm having to reassess, oh, nope, I have no idea what this means.
I'm so with you. This is exactly what I experienced with Peterson. I was telling Shelley this very thing, that when I read the Message, it's so different than my normal way of reading. It just doesn't match any other translation. And so it's not that Peterson is wrong, though I think occasionally, he's fallible, right? So surely there are ways that he interprets the text that are wrong. But generally speaking, I think he's onto something, but he's following a bunny trail that I didn't know existed. And it makes me stop and go, wait a minute, what is actually going on in this text? And so then I start comparing it to other English versions, and then I start comparing it to the Hebrew or the Greek or whatever. And it's just fascinating, the world that opens up just because Peterson illuminated like a trail that I didn't know existed.
Yeah, absolutely. Or, and for me, like I said, it's so often not just a trail I didn't know existed. It's a trail I thought I'd walked 100 times, but like this phrase, crowned him with glory and honor. Every word in that sentence is metaphorical, and I have run over it thoughtlessly 100 times. And even now, having thought about it, I'm still not sure what it's trying to say. It's almost like he nails, there's a signpost that he puts down that says, there's a trail here. Yeah. And suddenly I'm like, oh, look, there's a trail there. And
yeah,
so maybe you're right. Maybe that's exactly it. It's a trail that I never knew existed. Is a great way to put it as I talk it through. But what about you? What Psalms thoughts have you had?
Yeah. Well, so again, Peterson helped me see. I think Peterson illuminated this a little bit more clearly. This is a pattern that I've seen often in the Psalms, and I kind of don't know what to do with it, but I had a thought, and I want to run it by you and see what you make of this. So I'm just going to read out of the Message, since we're very Peterson-like today. And this is the end of chapter 6. And I love the language that he uses here. He just paints an amazing picture. So his translation reads, I'm tired of all this, so tired. My bed has been floating 40 days and nights on the flood of my tears. My mattress is soaked, soggy with tears. The sockets of my eyes are black holes. Nearly blind, I squint and grope. And then the very next segment. Get out of here, you devil's crew. At last, God has heard my sobs. My requests have all been granted. My prayers are answered. And I'm going, how do you go from that one to the next? And the psalmist is doing this in whatever translation you read, going from I am pouring my heart out to God to, I have victory over my enemies. And you're going, that's a huge switch. Like, what kind of, you got 8 hours of sleep, buddy. But And so here's what I think is happening. I think the psalmist is saying all of this in faith. I don't think 10 days later, after it all resolved, he's coming back and finishing the psalm. You know, when you've cried so much that you're just you're done, you can't cry anymore. And there's this almost resolve that comes, that there's this steely resolve that just says, no, this is not going to end me or whatever. And I kind of feel like that's what's going on in the psalm. He's just saying, and now I've cried it all out, and I absolutely believe that the end result is going to be Yahweh is going to save me from all of my enemies. And I believe it so much that I'm just going to stand up from my soggy, wet mattress and I'm going to say, get out of here. It's already finished.
Mm.
How do you read it? I mean, I feel I don't know. That's how it felt to me, but I'm not sure if I'm reading that correctly.
You know, I think there's a number of possible options. My take without argument, my take without the conversation would have been that the whole thing is a reflective exercise. I would have assumed that he has gone through the various phases of this experience, the soggy tears, the redemption from God, where God acts, all of that. And then later on, he's processing it into a poem, because writing a poem takes time.
Mm.
But I think it is equally plausible to say he's anywhere in the process, and he's processing this via writing the poem. And so I think the thing that strikes me is that the processing of the experience of hurt and loss and pain and sorrow and whatever that was that made him weep, thinking deeply about it leads him to this next step, which is that God is going to act, or is going to act, has acted, but there is an almost inevitability in thinking it through that leads him there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that probably there are enough psalms that follow this pattern that he wrote some of them at all of those different times.
Sure. That's fascinating. I told you in a different context the other day that when we're coaching at 911, when we're coaching a new employee and doing on-the-job training, that employee is slow to pick up the nuances of the story or to see how it's going to end or whatever. And we use this analogy quite frequently. Yeah, I've seen this movie before. I know how this ends. I've seen this movie 1,000 times. But if you're brand new, this is the first time you're watching that movie, you don't quite know where it's going or how it's all going to play out. And I feel like the psalmist is yeah, I've watched this movie 1,000 times. I know how this ends. I've been there. And so he could literally be in any stage of the process, as you said, and be able to write the same poem because I know how this ends.
I think that's it exactly. And it's why I love the fact that there are a bunch of poems like this. I think there is a cumulative and inspired power to this theme of poems being in the Psalter.
Yeah, there's a cumulative effect on the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've seen this story before. I know how this ends. That's helpful.
Well, as always, are you ready to really take a left turn in the conversation? And it's all downhill from here.
You'd think we'd have better transition language by now to go from great thoughts to Which Josh, but
I don't know that, I got nothing.
Well, that's right. Well, this week's Which Josh question is, which Josh took his parents sightseeing to a gas station?
And this is me. Just recently, a week and a half ago.
You're a terrible host.
I'm not, though, because they wanted to go. They asked me.
Those Missouri gas stations, there's something else.
Well, it's because, and the further south you live, the more likely you are to have guessed where this conversation is going. It's because my parents had never been to a Buc-ee's before.
Okay, so for all the people who don't live in Missouri, what's a Buc-ee's?
It's not Missouri. It started in Texas, and it is this gas station chain that has kind of stretched throughout the South. And it is this giant gas station. I think there's 64 pumps at this gas station.
Wow.
And the inside is, have you been to a Cracker Barrel?
Yes.
Okay. So the manager of Buc-ee's said, we kind of think of ourselves as the Cracker Barrel gift store on steroids.
Okay.
And that about covers it. It's this massive gas station, convenience store / gift shop / restaurant. It has amazingly good barbecue, almost as good as any place else you can get. And I live in a place that has good barbecue. And so it's this very weird amalgamation of several different things. And it is a thing that, starting in Texas and moving your way out, people are wildly loyal to. There is a passionate loyalty. And so if you've never been to a Buc-ee's, going to Buc-ee's is a thing. And my parents wanted to go to Buc-ee's, and so we took them.
And based on what you could experience, did they enjoy it? Was it great, I've done the thing?
So excited. They loved it. I mean, it's big enough. I dropped them off at the door because finding parking was going to be difficult. And when I got back to the inside of the store, it took me over 10 minutes to find them.
Oh my goodness.
It's really big and super funny.
Yeah. Okay. You took your parents to sightseeing at a gas station, and now I feel like half of our audience is like, yeah, okay, I'd like to go now.
Well, why don't we let them? Are we going to talk again next week?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, I'll talk to you then.
Okay, bye.
Bye.